Hey, it's Amia Jetski, and today we are talking about Metroid Lost Media. Before we start though, I will have to ask you to please like and sub, as it really helps out the channel. Also, we just hit 91 subscribers, so let's go. Also, we're really close to 100, let's see if we can't get there pretty soon. Anyways, let's hop right into the video. Now, the first piece of lost media related to Metroid is actually very infamous. You see, in the late 90s, in an issue of Nintendo Power, they showed off a screenshot for a director's cut of Metroid 2 on the Game Boy. However, this time it showed off a brand new area, as well as it having the full capability of color. Now, the most mysterious thing is the fact that other than this couple of screenshots, it was never talked about or even mentioned again. Now, there are two big main theories about this game and why it was shown off specifically in this magazine. Now, the first is that it was cancelled right after its reveal in this magazine, explaining why it was never really shown off much of anywhere else. Now, an equally popular idea is the fact that this may have been nothing more than a strange April Fool's joke. Now, this theory does have some merit, because in fact this issue was released sometime in April. However, this was released pretty late in April, so the fact is that it still may be real. That's pretty much all I have to say on this piece of Metroid Lost Media. It was quite interesting, but not much else to say about it. On to the next thing. Now, the next piece of Metroid Lost Media we are talking about today is a very fascinating one. You see, Metroid Fusion was actually meant to be released on the Game Boy Color. Now, the thing that fascinates me the most with this game is how the graphics are so radically different from the finalized version. Also, there's a lot of moves and stuff taken out of this game as well. Originally, you were supposed to actually be able to run up walls, which is really interesting, and I'm surprised they kind of cut that, but I guess time constraints just wouldn't allow them to have that in the final game. Did You Know Gaming actually did an incredible article on it. I suggest you check it out. I will put a link to it in the comments below. Very interesting piece of lost media. That's pretty much all I have to say on this one though. On to the next thing. The next piece of lost media is about a Metroid movie that was being made by the legendary filmmaker John Woo. If you don't know who that is, he is best known for that 2003 Hulk movie that came out. Of course, I'm joking. He's most known for his kung fu movies, but apparently in the early 2000s, he had wanted to make a movie about Metroid, which is very fascinating. Now, after getting the rights, he decided to start working on a script. He had put years into this movie, and somehow Nintendo just wasn't very interested in it, so he had to go back and fix it again and again and again and again. Eventually, however, he finally had a script that Nintendo was very interested in. It was actually a Samus Aran origin story, which is really interesting to me, and very interesting to the filmmakers. In fact, that's probably why Nintendo agreed to make this movie, because they themselves had not actually thought of an origin story for Samus Aran. So at this point, it had seemed like everything was ready to go. They had a script finished, they had done lots of concept art, they even thought about some casting possibilities. Until Nintendo pulled out last minute and got cold feet due to, I don't know, not enough faith in the brand or some dumb stuff like that. I don't know. It was really dumb though. Now, you might be wondering, how exactly does this qualify as lost media instead of just being something that got cancelled? Well, it relates to the fact that all the concept art and scripts that were made for this movie have never actually surfaced since its cancellation. Outside of a few brief descriptions, that's pretty much the only idea of what we have about this movie and what it would have been about. That's pretty much all I have to say on this one, though. Really unfortunate. Hope something comes of it one day. On to the next one. Now, the next piece of Metroid Lost Media is a very interesting one. You see, at one point there was a completely different version of Metroid Zero Mission, which is very fascinating. Also, it relates all the way back to Metroid Fusion, which earlier I just talked about. It's really interesting, and it has a completely different style. You see, Metroid Zero Mission had actually gone for a more realistic kind of style, but in this early footage, it actually shows a more chibi kind of style, which is very strange, and not something you'd expect from a Metroid game. There's not really much else to say on this piece of lost media. Overall, I hope some of this stuff gets found eventually, but for now it's remaining lost. On to the next thing. The next piece of Metroid Lost Media is maybe one of the most infamous ones ever. You might know it by a lot of names, and in fact it did get released recently, but that doesn't change the fact of how much lost media has come from it. The game I'm talking about in question is Metroid Dread. Now, you might be wondering, well, how exactly can this qualify as lost media if it did in fact get released? That's a pretty good question, actually. You see, Metroid Dread had actually started development all the way back in 2006 on the Nintendo DS. And in case you didn't already know, the Nintendo DS has actually been replaced like twice now. 3 times if you want to count the Nintendo 2DS. So that just begs the question of what happened during this game's development to cause it to go from the Nintendo DS all the way to the Nintendo Switch, which is quite a jump. So the first problem they ran into was just not being happy with the hardware they were given. For some reason, they just had such a hard time understanding how to use the DS effectively. They ended up coming up with an interesting strategy of just having the bottom screen be the map and the top screen actually be the gameplay, which, you know, was what they ended up going with for most of their game time development. Another idea was to use both screens, so she would switch between the screens, which was an interesting idea as well. Unfortunately, we have no screenshots of either of these because not a single screenshot from the early versions of Metroid Dread has actually been released. In fact, that was probably the biggest problem with Metroid Dread's development overall, was the fact that they couldn't have a single idea set in stone during the DS days. So many ideas would come through every day, and they were not making any progress at all, which is why a year into development, Nintendo decided to pull the plug, only to bring it back a couple months later. After 4 whole years of on-again, off-again development, Nintendo finally decided it was not financially viable to continue development. Later on, however, Nintendo had shown some interest in reviving the project on the Nintendo 3DS. However, that didn't really work out, and it kinda just died not too long after the pitch. We instead, however, got Metroid Samus Returns instead of Dread, which I think was a good choice as it reinstated Metroid as a viable Nintendo franchise. Finally, we had received Metroid Dread on the Nintendo Switch last year, a whole 15 years after it began development. Metroid Dread was finally released to worldwide praise. Fans were ecstatic that Metroid had finally made its big comeback. That's pretty much all I have to say on this piece of lost media. Definitely very interesting to talk about, and I'm still wanting to see a lot of those screenshots because I think the story is just so interesting, and I'm curious to see how much the game has truly changed, because from what it sounds like, it's changed drastically. On to the next thing. The next piece of Metroid Lost Media I will be talking about is very infamous. In fact, it's a lot more recent than the rest of these. I'm talking about the lost version of Metroid Prime 4. Being announced at E3 2017, 5 years later, and we still don't have anything from the game. All that we know is that Nintendo has completely restarted development, which begs the question, what happened to the original version of Metroid Prime 4? Outside of the basic idea of this game, we have basically nothing. Not a single screenshot. All we have is the title. Unfortunately, that's all I can really talk about with this. Hope we can find more information on it. Maybe one day it'll turn out like Metroid Dread and get released, even if it is like 15 years later after it starts development. On to the conclusion. Overall, I'll say that Metroid has a lot of lost media, probably stuff that we don't even know about yet. That's basically all I have to say for today. If you enjoyed, please like and sub. This was actually a viewer requested video, so if you have any more recommendations for lost media that I should look at, tell me about it in the comments below. It was Amiya Jetski, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.